Today, I am very excited to talk to you about why you should at least consider using Redux today. Note on the slides, historically, people do tend to say that I have entirely too much text on my slides, which is accurate. There is a copy of the slides on my blog, blog.isquaredsoftware.com. I will have a QR code at the end as well, but if you want to pop them open and follow along, you can grab the link from there. So, a few things about myself. I am a senior engineer at Replay, where we have built a time-traveling debugger for JavaScript, and we're currently investigating ways to use time travel to make AI programming agents smarter. If you haven't had a chance, please check it out. I am an answerer of questions. I will answer questions about React and Redux and JavaScript pretty much anywhere there is a text box on the internet. I collect all kinds of useful and interesting links to articles and resources and then proceed to copy and paste them to answer questions. I write extremely long blog posts, 6,000, 10,000 words, mostly about React and Redux. And I am a Redux maintainer. I've written most of our tutorials and documentation at this point. I've published the last several versions of React Redux. I created Redux Toolkit. But yes, most people do tend to know me as that guy with the Simpsons avatar. It's become my trademark. So why are we even having this talk anyway? Historically, we Redux maintainers have really not spent any time at all trying to market Redux or encourage people to use it. Instead, we've actually spent most of our time saying, no, you probably shouldn't have tried to use Redux in that application in the first place. That was a bad idea. Rather, our goal as maintainers, we're not trying to win market share or beat the competition. Rather, we just want to make sure that Redux is a very good tool that works well so that if you choose to use it, it will serve you well. But there are constant questions about when should I use Redux? Is Redux better or worse than this other tool? And so, like Daniel said, a lot of my time is spent explaining and answering questions. So the goal here is not to try to sell you on using Redux, but rather to give you information. As Ottawa said earlier, it's about trade-offs and understanding what tools do. So, we are going to do a history lesson. That's my usual thing. We're going to go back and look at why Redux was created, what were the problems we were trying to solve in the first place. We're going to look at how the ecosystem has evolved since then. We will discuss some of the trade-offs, and then I will actually give some reasons why it's worth considering Redux today. I have a limited amount of time. I could talk about this stuff for hours. I am not going to explicitly say Redux versus Tool X. I'm not even going to talk about how awesome Redux Toolkit is, although you really should try it out if you haven't. So, history lesson time. React itself came out publicly in 2013, and there was all the discussion of JSX, is this good or bad, do we like it or not? And then about a year later, Facebook came back, and at the next conference, they said, we've been trying to use React inside of Facebook's UI, and we've been using it with some existing data model libraries, and we're really struggling to keep data in sync across different parts of our application. The classic example was the notifications icon still shows some unread messages, even though you have actually read them. And they also said that we've really struggled trying to understand where, when, why, and how state is actually getting updated in our application, and what will actually change when we update a piece of state. And so they said, we've come up with this pattern that we're calling the flux architecture. And it's less of a library and more of a way of organizing the code and the data flow where we centralize some of the behaviors. And so most of Redux's terms and concepts actually come directly from this flux architecture idea originally. So after Flux was announced, Facebook published a couple small utilities that would help with this, but not a complete library. And so the React ecosystem began publishing dozens of different Flux-inspired libraries, mostly with names that were like bad Back to the Future movie-based jokes like McFly or whatever. I refer to this period as the Flux Wars. And so in early 2015, Dan Abramov, who was getting involved with React at the time, published a blog post called The Case for Flux, where he compared how existing libraries like Backbone had certain problems and how Flux would solve some of those problems. So the big takeaway here is that in 2014 and 2015, the problems we as a community were thinking about were things like client-side state management and how do you manage state within the application. So in May of 2015, Dan put up a post called The Evolution of Flux Frameworks, and of course he started writing his own. Now, the funny thing about it is, in a lot of ways, Redux was just originally meant to be a demo for a conference talk. Dan wanted to do a talk on time travel debugging. He just didn't have a library that would do that yet. And so Redux was meant to implement that idea. And so if we look at some of the design goals that he had at the time, he wanted to be able to hot reload code. He wanted to be able to efficiently subscribe to updates. He wanted to have dev tools that would show you what were happening inside the application. I wrote a blog post a couple years later that I dubbed the Tao of Redux, where I went back and looked at some of the early discussions and concepts and tried to further describe what was the mindset, what was the intent behind Redux. And so to summarize a few of those, one, Redux was just another Flux architecture library. It wasn't even meant to be a take over the world thing. It was just, we're building yet another library that implements this pattern. The goal was to make state code maintainable. We want to make it easy to understand what's going on, and you should be able to see a history of what is going on in the application, the list of things that the user did. There was a goal of trying to apply functional programming principles to Flux, and it really was intended to promote very testable code. And finally, the goal was that the update logic and the data flow were intended to be very explicit, not implicit. Along with that, some other concepts, we had the idea that you organize your logic based on the different types of data in your application: users, posts, comments. The core APIs of the library should be pretty minimal, but it should also be extensible as well. So Dan and Andrew started working on this in the summer of 2015, and within just a couple months, they had rapidly iterated and settled on the concepts that became Redux as we know it today. So Dan did his talk in July of 2015, and version 1 came out the next month, 2 months from beginning of development to release. And the React community kind of jumped on this. The idea of Flux was already established, and a lot of the early adopters said, ooh, Redux looks really good, we'll start using it. And again, without Dan and Andrew really trying to push it, the React community kind of began to assume that if you're using React, you have to be using Redux as well. So the core of the Redux libraries stayed the same for the next couple years. We put out a version 5 of React Redux in late 2016 that sped up performance. We put out version 6 in 2018 that was trying to modernize some of the internals, and then it also turned out to be a very bad architectural decision, and that one was my fault. I'm sorry. React 16.8 came out with hooks in spring of 2019. And so we rewrote React Redux again to use hooks internally a couple months later, but then we shipped our own hooks API in the summer of 2019. In late 2019, we shipped Redux Toolkit, which provided a set of functions to make it easier to work with Redux code. And then a year later, I rewrote our tutorials to teach Redux Toolkit as the default. About a year after that, we shipped RTK Query, which was a new piece included in the Redux Toolkit package that provided built-in data fetching, much like React Query or Apollo or SWR. And then about a year later, I officially marked the old-style Redux create store method as deprecated. And then many people started yelling at me about that. That's a separate discussion. And then finally, in December of 23, I spent all of that year modernizing the Redux packages for better ESM CommonJS packaging support. That was a pain. I can also rant about that one for a while. So why did people even start using Redux in the first place? There's a lot of different reasons. Some of them, for example, the old style React Context API was actually very broken. You couldn't really pass updated values through it. And so people would use Redux as a workaround to bypass that. Of all the dozens of different Flux libraries, it was the best one, and so people began to adopt it because of that. If you were using the original implementations of React hot module reloading, they would throw away the component and all the local component state that was inside. And so some people would stick with Redux because it could keep the data in the UI as you were developing your components. And then there were various thought leaders who would be telling you that you should use Redux. Again, not the maintainers, like other people in the community. But there were also a number of architectural reasons. Like I said, Redux wants you to use some functional programming principles, which really aligns with how React was meant to be used as well. In addition, React state really has to match the shape of your component tree, which is why if you keep hoisting state up to the top of the tree, eventually you wind up with the contexts at the top of the tree that have all the data for the application. So sometimes your data has a different shape than your component tree does. And there is architectural value in taking your data layer and centralizing it separate from the component tree. And along with that, some of the principles of Redux, that there should be a consistent pattern throughout the application for how things are actually updated, that it should be easy to test functions like reducers and selectors because they're pure. It's just arguments in, result out, very easy to test, and things like the time travel debugging and the dev tools. So which of these reasons still matter today? Okay, fine, most of those historical reasons don't exist anymore. We now have the modern context API, which works great. Nobody cares or remembers about Flux implementations anymore. Modern React fast refresh is great for reloading the components. And trust me, we don't have thought leaders telling you should use Redux today. But things like architecture and predictability and consistency are still very relevant principles as we write applications today. Now, the React ecosystem has also changed. Oh, whoa, come back here. Come back here. Yay. OK, there we go. The React ecosystem has changed a lot over the last several years. As I said, in 2015, the mindset was we're trying to solve client-side state management. And in the process, we kick off side effects. Now, it turns out that the one big thing for side effects is actually fetching data from the server. And so starting in 2017, 2018, we really had this mindset shift. Tanner Lindsley really helped popularize the idea that what we're really thinking about is syncing state with the server. And that's a very different way to view our applications. Now, along with that, Redux went through the usual hype cycle, like most tools do. You know, for a couple years, it was very hot, and everyone's excited. It's like, let's put Redux everywhere, including forms. That was a bad idea. But after people had used it for a couple years and written code bases, and now people start to have to maintain those code bases, people began to see the pain points, again, like any other tool. And one of the valid complaints was that early Redux was very boilerplatey and kind of painful to deal with. But also, there were generations of developers who were now having to use Redux who had never worked with the older tools or experienced the problems that Redux was trying to solve. And so there's also been a lot of other competing solutions for the same problem space. Redux is a pretty generic tool. You can use it for a lot of different things, but now we have things like, server-side apps or multi-page apps that have less state on the client, different ways to fetch data, different ways to handle accessing state throughout the application, context for passing values. But on the other hand, Redux itself has changed as well. Redux today, or even starting in 2019, with Redux Toolkit and the React Redux hooks, you're writing the same application, but the feel of using Redux today is very, very different than it was in 2017 or 2018. Redux Toolkit provides a lot of different methods to simplify all the standard Redux usage patterns, solve a lot of the boilerplate concerns, and even prevent a lot of the common bugs that we saw. It also includes the RTK query layer for data fetching, again, very similar to like a React query or an Apollo, where you can define a set of endpoints and get a bunch of auto-generated hooks, and then just use those in your components. We also had the shift from the old-style React Redux Connect API, which worked using the patterns of the time, but a lot of people found it confusing. And now you have the React Redux Hooks API, use selector and use dispatch, which are a lot simpler. Along with that, Redux from the beginning was very, very unopinionated. We didn't really give advice on the right ways to organize your code or define your actions or anything else, and people argued a lot about how you should use it. So we started to find that certain patterns worked better. And so we've included those patterns in the docs, given advice on how to organize, name, and test the code. So, like I said, ultimately it's all about trade-offs. One of Dan's early quotes, right, as he was building Redux, was that Redux is designed to answer the question, when does a given slice of state change, and where does the data come from? It's not meant to be the most performant or shortest way to write the code, but it is meant to be predictable. I like to say that both React and Redux are kind of an 80% solution. They're good for most apps in most situations. They're not going to be the absolute fastest, but they are good enough for most applications. So, quick run through a few of the trade-offs. Redux asks you to add a level of indirection, the concept of dispatching an action that describes what happened instead of just directly mutating a piece of state. And there is value in separating the what happened from how do things update. It lets you move logic out of the UI, it scales better as an app grows, but it is going to be more code than just saying state.value equals 1, 2, 3. Redux asks you to have a single store for the application. And centralization allows you to have a single place where you do things like trace the history of the application or add middleware for logging, but it also means that people have a tendency to just shove everything in there, whether it should have been in the store or not. And it's maybe not the most optimized way to handle lots and lots of high-speed updates. We've found the pattern of having slices of state, where you've got a reducer for users, a reducer for posts, etc. And the idea is that having more logic as pure functions makes them easier to test in isolation, and you know exactly, like, if I have this data in my store, that's where I go to find the update logic. Historically, immutable updates have been a pain. Immer really helps with that. But it's also true that sometimes organizing the logic for this can be a little bit difficult. Like with React, Redux wants you to use plain JS objects and data. Most of the time, this is not a problem. It also enables things like the dev tools or persistence. Occasionally, there might be something where having like a set or a map might make some logic easier, and you might have to work around that. Usually, it's not too much of a problem. So, we are close to the end. I've spent a lot of time discussing trade-offs and history, so now let me attempt to actually say why you ought to at least consider using it. Redux does provide a consistent architectural pattern. You have your reducers, you have your slices of state, you know that when the user does something, they're going to dispatch an action, it's going to go over here to the reducer, the state's updated, and the UI has subscribed to it, selects the data, and it will re-render. It's a very consistent pattern, there's no magic, there are a couple steps, but you know when I click the button, these things will happen every time. So it makes it easier to mentally model what pieces of my app are going to update. Redux is usually going to give you a better understanding of what's going on in the application. The Redux dev tools have always been one of the biggest reasons to use Redux. They are very powerful. The ability to look at it and see the history of the actions, the state changes, the differences in the piece of state is still incredibly valuable. It is widely used. Now, popularity is not the reason you should use any tool, something nobody got fired for using IBM, whatever. But it is actually a valid consideration. As we're evaluating tools and making decisions, you probably don't want to use the tool that has 7 stars on GitHub and 20 NPM downloads a week. So using tools that are well known, that are well documented, that have common patterns, people know them already, is a thing to consider when choosing tools. On that note, I would like to say that Redux is very well documented. Obviously, I'm biased. I've written a lot of the documentation. But we do have thorough documentation, tutorials, FAQs, usage pages. Like, if you have any question about what to do in Redux, we probably have a docs page that answers that. Occasionally, people have told us we have too much documentation. I can understand why they might say that. I would rather have too many docs pages than too few. And in terms of technical performance, the arguments over context in Redux go on all the time. I'm really, really tired of it, which is why I've written a couple of very long blog posts comparing them. Loosely speaking, Redux has better performance update-wise than context does because you can selectively subscribe to pieces of state. The caveats to that are that you can split things up into multiple contexts, and the upcoming React compiler will change the calculus on that. Unfortunately, there is a talk coming up about that shortly. Redux Toolkit does provide a lot of built-in pieces. Other libraries are a little more bare bones, and you have to kind of reinvent some wheels. Redux Toolkit comes with a lot of common patterns built in, including the RTK query data fetching layer. In fact, one of the reasons some people have said that they prefer to use Redux and RTK over something like React Query is we have the ability to fully generate a set of endpoints from an OpenAPI spec definition. So take OpenAPI, get all your client code generated, get all the hooks, done. We've designed RTK to work great with TypeScript. We've put a lot of effort into trying to give you a good TypeScript developer experience. And while we assume that most people using Redux are using it with React, you've always been able to use Redux separately, either by itself or with any other UI layer. And so there are times when that is actually a valuable thing. All right, so actually managing to finish on time, wonderful. Hopefully that's given you a little bit of history and insight into why was Redux even created in the first place, what problems was it trying to solve, which of those problems actually still matter, and what are the trade-offs that Redux gives you. Again, I'm not trying to say you should use Redux or that you should migrate from Zeus10 to Jotai to Redux, but Redux is still both alive and well, and it is still a very valid tool in many different applications today. So if you're building an application, my encouragement is understand the problems you're trying to solve, look at consider the trade-offs, look at Redux and see if it would help you solve those problems, and then make an appropriate decision for your own application. All right, obligatory QR code link to the slides. I will be around after this to try to answer questions. Hopefully that's given you some insight, and thank you very much.